These are a few components needed in an aftermarket fuel system. If you don't know what they are, this is probably the video for you. So stick around, I'm going to explain what all of the major components in an aftermarket fuel system are and what they do to make your car go faster. Now I do want to preface this. This is not going to be me actually building anything. This is more of an informational sort of setup. Now, I know a lot of people don't necessarily know what all the components are. What do they do? Who knows? What are they called? What do you search for? Well, I'm going to explain that. So I'm going to get to writing things down, show you exactly the basic overview. I mean, it can get as complicated as you want it to be. Some fuel systems are multi-$1,000 systems. But this will give you a basic overview of everything and all the crucial components that you absolutely do need at a bare minimum. So let's get into it, and I'll start getting sciencey on you. All right, here we go. So we're gonna start all the way at where you put the gas in and work all the way to where right before the gas goes in the engine. So first thing you have all the way in the back, typically it's a nice little box, and that is your fuel cell. Now this, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a cell that holds the fuel. So it's where the gas goes. Now, a lot of times the fuel pump is internal of this, but sometimes it is external. Fuel cells come in many shapes and sizes, many different brands. You can get cheap ones, you can get very expensive ones. The top of the line ones are SFI rated for fire and accidents and all that stuff, but you can go all the way down to your eBay special fuel cells, and these are basically just an aluminum box. But moving on from the fuel cell, which is where you put the fuel, then it goes into your fuel pump. Now this, like I said before, it can either be internal of the fuel cell, but it can also be external, where it just exists on its own without necessarily being in anything at all. This is an example of an internal fuel pump. This is a Walbro 525. The 525 stands for liters per hour. Now, in order to have your fuel pump effectively, there's usually a pre-filter that is somewhere in between raw fuel, whether it's gas, ethanol, methanol, whatever you want. It's a pre-filter. Now sometimes this is just a screen, sometimes they call them fuel socks, and Holley even has a thing they call a hydromat, which is it helps with fuel scavenging. But there has to be some sort of pre-filter before the fuel pump, that way large debris doesn't get into your fuel pump and kill it, which effectively leans out your engine and can detonate it and blow it up if it's not filtered properly. Now, moving on from the fuel pump, you have fuel filters. And when I say fuel filters, it's usually because it is plural, but sometimes you can run a singular fuel filter. This is an example of an inline fuel filter. This is from Aeromotive. They make some of the best fuel components in the game. These are very, very important. Do not run a fuel system without fuel filters, otherwise you can damage your fuel injectors. Small debris gets inside your injectors, it clogs it breaks the diaphragm. Bad things can happen if it's not being filtered. Now, usually this kind of cluster resides in the trunk. Unless, of course, you have a very specialized thing, but then all bets are off. This is kind of that subset that if you look in the back of a race car, you'll see fuel cell, whether it's red, blue, black, silver, whatever. It's usually powder coated steel. And if it's an external fuel pump, they'll usually be mounted right on top of the fuel cell, just to keep everything packaged nice and tidy. Internal ones are exactly like that. They're internal of the fuel cell, so you don't see them, you just see lines coming out the top of it that then route essentially a fuel filter, a fuel pump, which is internal, and then routes straight into the fuel filters. And then from these, you usually have your not gigantic, but very long lines that run all the way forward. So this gets you all the way to, I'll call the next cell, the engine bay. I hope I drew this box big enough. Now, depending on the setup, you will go from the fuel filters all the way up to either the fuel rail, or depending on your system setup, you can have it go to the fuel pressure regulator. Now, an example of a fuel pressure regulator is this little guy. This is from Radium. It is their multi-port fuel pressure regulator. It's also, Radium makes some very good components. Now, obviously, fuel starts here, goes to the fuel pump, gets cleaned by the filters, and then it goes to the fuel rail. So if we go this path and we go to the fuel rail, then it moves on to fuel injectors. Now, an example of a fuel injector is this. And these are gonna be on any fuel injected engine. Now, if it's direct injected, different type. If it's a carburetor, it's a carburetor, it's not fuel injected. Now these are what people typically spec out when they're doing a certain amount of horsepower. You spec your fuel injectors. Now, fuel goes the whole system, goes to the fuel rail, it goes to the fuel injectors. But this piece, fuel pressure regulator, is a very important piece because fuel circulates. It's a big loop because the fuel pump is always pumping, and whatever extra fuel has to get returned back to the fuel cell. So a very common setup is to go the cell to the pump, through the filters, to the fuel rail, and then at the fuel rail point, this is where things the magic sort of happens. If the fuel is going into the engine, it goes through the injectors, which then feed the runners, which then go into the engine, explode, cool. Then out of the injectors, cylinder, and then exhaust. So if your fuel is actually getting burned, this is the cycle. It goes cell, pump, clean it, get it to the injectors, spit it out the injectors into the cylinder, gets burnt, gets spit out the exhaust. But say the fuel doesn't go through the injectors. Say it's on that kind of loop path. Then it comes out of the fuel rail and goes to your fuel pressure regulator. I will abbreviate that FPR because that's a lot of words. And then this is what actually sets your pressure to feed the injectors. The injectors have no control over pressure. All they do is open and close very efficiently and very accurately. So they basically open, the pressure that's in the rail spits the fuel out the injector, and then it closes. This fuel pressure regulator does exactly what its name is. It regulates the pressure to a set point. And that data, that pressure, is very important to your ECU and a lot of standalone systems because it's just a big part of the giant calculation that is how much fuel do we dump into the engine. After it gets out of the fuel pressure regulator, it usually circulates right back to the fuel cell. So this is that loop that fuel goes through if it doesn't get burnt or injected. If it gets burnt, injected, it goes through the injectors, through the cylinder, and it gets spit out. That as a whole is the basics of an aftermarket fuel system. Now each one of these things, all of it can be very, very complicated. When you look at it as an overall system, it doesn't seem that bad. You got a thing that holds the fuel, a thing that moves it, things that clean it, and then things that put it into the engine. From that aspect, it is very simple, but to actually figure out what fuel cell do you need, what fuel pump do you need, what flow rating, how much do you have to filter it? Because a micron rating can range anywhere from 10 to 1,000. What is the actual requirement for that? How big of a fuel rail do you need? If you're burning a lot of fuel, well, guess what? All of that fuel has to be sitting in the fuel rail in order to get injected to get burnt. So it's very complicated when it comes to figuring out what it actually is. So in the next video, I'm actually going to show you how to spec your entire fuel system, and we're actually going to get even more complicated using mathematical equations, figuring out, okay, if we want horsepower this and we need injectors this, how do we spec everything else? Speccing a fuel system is one of the most controversial and misunderstood systems that exists. So I'm going to show you how to actually figure it out for yourself. Hopefully you learned something. If you didn't, cool. If you did, fantastic. If you want to learn more, just subscribe. I'm going to keep doing more content. I'm going to try and do it more frequently and just get more stuff out there for people to learn, because I have way too much stuff in my head that it seems like some people don't necessarily understand. So until next time, if you have any questions, please leave a comment and I will answer it. And if it's something that a lot of people don't understand, I'll actually make a video on it. Then even more people will see it. But until then, I mean, just keep it moving.